Walter Ernst was Gauleiter of Halle-Merseburg and later mayor of Bromberg. A Gau was an administrative region of Nazi Germany, like a state, and the Gauleiter was the man who ran it. As the Red Army rolled west, he refused orders to have civilians fight to the end and fled to Danzig, where he was arrested by his own men. Himmler branded him a coward, stripped his rank, dumped him in a penal battalion, and gave him high-risk assignments. It worked as intended. He was killed near Pelblin in March 1945, most likely torn apart by artillery shrapnel, aged 45. Paul Hinkler took over Halle-Merseburg after Ernst, then ran the police in Altona and Wuppertal. He was a violent drunk who'd already been quietly demoted twice before the war even started. When Allied troops closed in on his hideout near Freiburg, he swallowed poison on April 13, 1945 and was found dead days later. Franz Kutschera was a former Gauleiter of Carinthia who became SS and police leader of Warsaw, where in barely 5 months he ordered the public mass execution of nearly 1,800 Poles across 35 staged street shootings, the names of the dead posted around the city each day as a warning. The Polish underground tried him in absentia, sentenced him to death and sent a team. On the morning of February 1st, 1944, a squad from the KDEV unit faked a traffic accident outside his Warsaw office to box in his car, then shot him and his driver dead at point-blank range while they still sat in the car. The whole thing took about 2 minutes. The next day, the Germans shot 300 Polish civilians in reprisal. The Gestapo built massive files on people to keep track of them. Thankfully today you don't have to accept your own personal information being scattered all over the internet. That's why I use Incogni. I was honestly surprised by how many sites had my personal information, from people's search websites to data brokers I'd never even heard of. Instead of spending hours trying to remove everything myself, Incogni automatically contacts hundreds of those companies and keeps requesting my data be deleted if it shows up again. And if something more specific appears online, like a particular page or search result, Incogni's custom removals lets you submit the link, and a dedicated privacy expert handles the rest. They can't misuse your data if they can't find it. You can try Incogni completely risk-free with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So start taking back control of your personal information now. Click the link in the description or go to incogni.com and use code PROFESSOR at checkout to get 60% off an annual plan. Joachim Albrecht Eggeling ran Halle-Merseburg from 1937 to the end. As US troops closed on Halle, he begged Hitler to lift the order to defend the city to the last man. The answer was no. So he walked back into his headquarters at Moritzburg Castle, sat down, put a pistol to his head and pulled the trigger on April 15, 1945, aged 60. Alexander von Falkenhausen was the German general who governed occupied Belgium, quietly tied to the resistance against Hitler. He was arrested in 1944 after the July 20th plot, and spent the rest of the war passed between concentration camps. After the war, Belgium tried him for the deportation of Jews and sentenced him to 12 years, then released him within weeks, once it came out how much he'd done to shield Belgian civilians and aid the underground. He died of natural causes in Nassau, West Germany, on July 31st, 1966, aged 87. Léon Degrelle was the Belgian fascist who ran the occupied territories of Belgium and northern France from 1944 onwards. He fought for the Waffen-SS on the Eastern Front and was praised by Hitler as exactly the kind of son he wished he'd had. He took 33 wounds in combat and was still standing when Germany fell. In May 1945, he stole a Heinkel from a Norwegian airfield, flew it down the Atlantic coast until the tanks ran dry, and crash-landed on a beach in San Sebastian, Spain. He broke both legs. But he was alive, and now he was Franco's problem. Belgium sentenced him to death in absentia and demanded him back for decades. Franco said no every single time. Degrelle gave interviews to neo-Nazi magazines into his 80s, denied the Holocaust on television, and died of cardiac arrest in a Malaga clinic on March 31st, 1994, aged 87, having never spent a day answering for any of it. Franz Böhme was the Wehrmacht general who took over occupied Norway as Reichskommissar in the dying days of the war. The Allies arrested him and held him at Nuremberg to answer for an earlier command in Serbia, where he'd ordered 100 civilians shot for every German killed. He never let them reach a verdict. On May 29, 1947, he climbed to the 4th floor of the Nuremberg prison and threw himself over the railing, falling to his death. Karl Hanke was Gauleiter of Lower Silesia and the hangman of Breslau, who turned his capital into a fortress and ordered over 1,000 executions during the siege, stringing up anyone who breathed the word surrender. Then Hitler named him the last Reichsführer SS, and Hanke instantly abandoned the doomed city he'd ordered everyone else to die for, slipping out by light aircraft. He latched onto an SS unit near Prague, disguised as a common private. Czech partisans captured him, never realizing who they had, and marched him on foot with the other low-ranking prisoners. On June 8, 1945, a freight train clattered past the column, and Hanke broke for it, but the guards opened fire and dropped him, then finished him off in the mud with rifle butts while he was still breathing. Konrad Henlein ran the Sudetenland Gau and oversaw the mass deportation of Czechs and Jews to the camps. In the final days of the war, he tried to convince Hitler to leave Berlin for the Sudetenland and launch a new offensive against the Soviets from its mountains. Hitler declined. American troops captured Henlein on May 9, 1945 and held him in a barracks in Pilsen. He asked his guards for a moment alone. Then he took off his spectacles, calmly snapped them against the wall and used the broken glass to open his wrists. He bled out on the cell floor. Wilhelm Grimm was a short-serving Gauleiter of Mittelfranken and for years the head of the Nazi Party's own internal court. When he turned up tied to the July plot against Hitler, the people he'd spent his career judging dealt with him the day after. He died on July 21, 1944, near Coswig, in what the party announced as a tragic car accident, complete with a funeral and an honorable burial to make it look legit. Josef Bürckel was crucial in acquiring new territory and ran the Pfalz-Saar and Vienna Gaue. But by 1944 he was a wreck, drinking himself into the ground while dysentery and pneumonia finished the job. He died of cardiac arrest in Neustadt an der Weinstraße on September 28, 1944, aged 49. Doctors said he was worn out, and the death report was altered to hide his breakdown. Fritz Bracht ran Upper Silesia, the Gau that held Auschwitz, and almost certainly knew exactly what was happening behind its fences. As the Red Army poured in from the east and the Reich collapsed around him, he and his wife crushed potassium cyanide capsules between their teeth together on May 9, 1945, the day after Germany surrendered. Karl Lenz was the Gauleiter of Hesse-Darmstadt, and for him there was no bullet, no bunker and no cyanide. He checked into a hospital in Freising, Bavaria, for a routine appendix surgery and died of the complications on November 7, 1944. Josef Goebbels was Hitler's propaganda chief and Gauleiter of Berlin, the man who believed in the 1,000-year Reich and stayed in the Führerbunker to watch it end. He stood as a witness at Hitler's rushed wedding. Then on May 1, 1945, he and his wife Magda made their own arrangements. Magda gave their 6 children, aged 4 to 12, a drink laced with morphine, and once they were asleep, an SS doctor crushed a cyanide ampule between each child's teeth. Then the couple climbed up to the Chancellery Garden where Magda took her dose and Goebbels bit down on his own capsule. Goebbels' last order was for an SS soldier to shoot both of them afterwards, just to be sure. The SS doused the bodies in petrol and burned them. Arthur Greiser ran the Wartheland, the annexed slice of Poland where Chełmno, the first dedicated extermination camp in the entire Nazi machine, operated under his authority. He had pushed hard for the murder of the region's Jews and Poles, and after the war they brought him back to answer for it. He was tried in Poznan, on the very streets he'd ruled, sentenced to death, and on July 21, 1946 hanged in public before 15,000 cheering Poles on a gallows built just for him. Some had brought their children to watch. It was the last public execution ever carried out on Polish soil. Fritz Wächtler was the alcoholic Gauleiter of Bayreuth, despised even by his own party officials. With American tanks grinding toward his capital in April 1945, he fled the city and set up in a small hotel near the Czech border with what was left of his staff. His deputy Ludwig Ruckdeschel, a fanatic who'd been waiting years for exactly this opening, denounced him to Bormann as a coward and deserter. He came back with orders to handle it personally. On April 19, 1945, Ruckdeschel rolled up to the hotel with 35 SS men, kicked in the doors, dragged Wächtler out into the courtyard, lashed him to a tree and had him shot. Then he took the Gau for himself and announced that the same was waiting for any other traitor. Albert Forster was the king of Danzig, who ran Danzig, West Prussia, and oversaw the murder of tens of thousands of Poles and Jews. When it ended, the king tried to vanish into the crowd in a plain soldier's uniform, but the Brits caught him and handed him to Poland. He was sentenced to death in 1948 and then, for reasons no one has ever fully explained, left to wait. He finally went to the gallows in Warsaw on February 28, 1952, where he was hanged. Gustav Simon was the Gauleiter of Moselland and the architect of the brutal Germanization of occupied Luxembourg, where he banned French, conscripted the young men into the Wehrmacht and deported thousands. When it ended, he simply disappeared, turning up in a small Westphalian village as a humble gardener, quietly growing vegetables. The man who found him was a British officer. Arrested on December 10, 1945, Simon tried to cut his wrists, was patched up, and 8 days later was found hanged in his Paderborn cell with a noose twisted from a torn bedsheet. Whether he finished it himself or had help is argued to this day. Karl Holz was Gauleiter of Franconia. With Americans already inside Nuremberg, he barricaded himself in the Palmenhof bunker at police headquarters with a knot of diehards, including the city's mayor, Willy Liebel, a man he'd loathed for years over who really ran the city. Inside the bunker, Liebel argued to surrender and stop the bloodshed. He was shot dead at close range, almost certainly by Holz, who followed him a short time later, on April 20th, 1945, Hitler's birthday, the day after the Führer awarded him the German order by radio for holding the city. Whether US fire took him as the bunker fell or he turned the same pistol on himself remains unknown. Josef Terboven was the Gauleiter of Essen, who went on to rule occupied Norway as Reichskommissar with a cruelty that embarrassed even other Nazis. He declared martial law in Trondheim, burned the village of Telavåg to the ground after 2 Gestapo men were killed there, and signed off on brutal reprisal executions on Norwegian civilians. Goebbels griped in his diary about his bullying tactics. Dismissed by Hitler's successor Dönitz, on May 7, 1945, he refused to surrender. The next night, he had his guards carry the body of SS chief Wilhelm Redis, already dead by his own pistol, into a bunker on the Skaugum estate near Oslo. Terboven walked in behind it, sat down on a plank and lit the fuse of 50 kilograms of dynamite. The blast tore both bodies past recognition and killed several other Germans sheltering nearby. Wilhelm Murr was the Gauleiter of Württemberg-Hohenzollern, and as French troops swept into the south, he and his wife ran for the Austrian Alps. Arrested in Vorarlberg, the two bit down on the cyanide capsules they'd been carrying for exactly this moment and died together in French custody on May 14, 1945. Paul Giesler ran Munich Upper Bavaria and was named Hitler's last interior minister, a post he never lived to hold. As US troops bore down on Berchtesgaden, he and his wife took poison together on May 8, 1945, when he was 49. By some accounts, the capsules didn't work properly and an adjutant had to finish the job with a pistol. Fritz Sauckel was the Gauleiter of Thuringia and Hitler's slave labor boss, the man who dragged more than 5 million people out of occupied Europe and into forced labor. Many of them worked straight into the grave. At Nuremberg, he insisted that he'd been nothing but a workforce manager. The court disagreed. He was hanged in the Nuremberg prison gymnasium on October 16, 1946, and the gallows that night were badly built, the trap too small. He struck his head on the way down and strangled slowly for several minutes. Julius Streicher was the first Gauleiter of Franconia and the publisher of the propaganda newspaper Der Stürmer. Even other Nazis found him repellent. Hitler stripped his Gau in 1940 over corruption, but kept him as a poison pen. Convicted at Nuremberg of incitement to extermination, he went out screaming on October 16, 1946, Heil Hitler, at the foot of the steps. Then, the Bolsheviks will hang you one day. The drop was botched, whether by accident or design. His head cracked the side of the trap, and the rope didn't break his neck. He took some 15 minutes to choke to death. Friedrich Rainer was the Gauleiter of Salzburg and then Carinthia. The British caught him and handed him to Yugoslavia, where a military court sentenced him to hang on July 19, 1947. But the execution didn't happen on schedule. Yugoslav intelligence kept him alive for years, quietly squeezing him for written detail on the Nuremberg defendants and his fellow Nazis. Documents surfacing in Slovenian archives in 2010 suggest the rope didn't come for him until late November 1950. Martin Mutschmann was the Gauleiter of Saxony for the full 20 years the party held power. He fled Dresden as Soviet troops moved in, was caught hiding in the mountains by local police, paraded through the town square to be jeered at, and then handed to the NKVD. After nearly 2 years in Moscow's Lubyanka prison, the Soviets sentenced him to death and stood him in front of a firing squad on February 14, 1947, one of the very few Gauleiters handed straight into Stalin's hands. Karl Gerland was the Gauleiter of Kurhessen, praised in Goebbels' final diary entries as a man performing superbly, while the world burned down around him. He was no pure deskman. He'd served as an infantry NCO in 1940 and had been wounded in the Battle of France. In the last weeks he went east with the rank of SS Brigadeführer and a rifle. And on April 21, 1945, as the Soviet drive on Berlin opened, he was killed in the fighting at Frankfurt an der Oder, aged 39. His body was never recovered from the field and no record survives of exactly how he fell. August Eigruber ran Upper Danube, the Gau that held Mauthausen. The Americans caught him in the Salzkammergut at war's end and condemned him to hang. He went up the steps in the courtyard of Landsberg prison on May 28, 1947, still loudly, openly proud of Hitler and everything he had done, defiant all the way to the trapdoor. Alfred Meyer ran Westphalia north. As the Ruhr pocket caved in around him, he vanished on April 11, 1945 and was found dead soon after in the woods beside the Weser River, having either shot himself or swallowed poison. Robert Ley ran the Gau of Rhineland South in the early years before taking over the German Labor Front and its cheerful strength through joy tourism scheme. The smiling face bolted onto Sauckel's slave system. A heavy drinker, he was caught in his pajamas at his Alpine hideout and dragged to Nuremberg to stand trial beside Göring. The charges terrified him. He read his indictment, then asked permission to write his memoirs. On the night of October 25, 1945, 2 weeks before the trial opened, he tore his bathroom towel into strips, plaited them into a rope, tied one end to the toilet pipe and the other around his neck, and choked himself to death sitting on the toilet seat. He left a note swearing his loyalty to Hitler. The trial began without him. Erich Koch was the Gauleiter of East Prussia and Reichskommissar of occupied Ukraine, responsible for the persecution of Polish and Ukrainian Jews. He fled west and hid in northern Germany until the British caught him in 1949. Poland tried him for the murder of 400,000 Poles and sentenced him to death. But the sentence was never carried out. Officially, it was his poor health. Unofficially, the Soviets may have wanted him alive for what he knew about the vanished Amber Room. For 27 years he lived in a comfortable, book-lined cell at Barczewo prison, reading, learning Polish, outliving nearly every other Nazi war criminal. He died there of old age on November 12, 1986 at 90. Friedrich Karl Florian ran Düsseldorf for the entire 15-year life of the Gau. He had 5 citizens shot in the final weeks of the war, but was caught by the Americans. Interned in a concentration camp, he tried to poison himself and jump out of a window, but failed twice to take his life. After just 4 years, he was released, simply went home and lived another 30 years unrepentant, swapping letters with the others who'd gotten away. He died of old age in his bed in Mettmann on October 24, 1975 at 81 and was buried beside his wife.